Can't compete with your beard, man. Can't compete with your beard.
Yeah, it's getting there. How are you?
Good, and yeah,
I'm good.
really.
Good.
It's noon, right, for you? Here we had already the long day. The day's almost done.
Yeah, it's a good way to wrap it up.
Yeah. At least in terms of intellectual work.
Yeah,
Still some other stuff waiting for me, hopefully today, but as in like fun stuff. But this is
yeah,
also
yeah. Yeah, I'm later this afternoon. I have tickets to a taping of the Colbert Report. So once this is done, I have a little bit more work, and then heading to that.
wow,
Yeah,
and that's in New York, right? No,
yeah,
so you're back from Canada.
yeah. I'm back from Vancouver. Yeah.
That's, that's good. Well, Vancouver is far away. You heard that on the 4th, looks like we're gonna have an event that we'll organize on our own.
Okay,
So without the SEC and whatever, it's just gonna be us.
okay, and that'll be November 4th.
Yeah,
Yep. All right, I'm gonna write
as
that
in
down.
like one day before the election.
Yeah.
So let's see if Catherine's here. Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. It's my office day from home, so
Nice.
you can see
Same here.
you can see how really I am seeing human beings. No.
Yeah.
I have actually seen human beings today, but not in the academic context. It was more like, did you get your food? Are you ready to go to work, to
Yeah,
school? Come on, move. This kind.
exactly.
Let's see. I think that Nathan also will join us. It's all good. I think
Yes.
it's a bit of an excitement. I didn't retweet stuff. Did you,
Uh,
Catherine?
I did not. Our
Ooh, we're off Twitter, right? We're off X. We're like,
yeah, we are not
X is
currently on.
off limits. Mm.
Yeah. We are in discussion about relaunching that page, and I think it would be helpful. So, but not for this, no. But I think William, you were mentioning maybe sending the
Dario and I did both tweet
yeah.
that. Yeah.
So
Hey
that's good.
Perry, how
Hello.
are you? Good to see you again after a long break. Hope you had a good time. And Sophia is there. Hey, you are already the co-animator, so nothing to be done from my side, so that's perfect. Sophia, do you know who goes first? Did you?
So originally we said that I would go first, but there's yours. Okay, sorry. So we agreed that I would go first, but I don't know if Benjamin has changed his mind because he's changing his topic a little bit. But I think I'm first.
You go first. That's good. So, gosh, and we have 9 minutes left, like one eternity and a half before we get. So it's yeah, we're getting excited here. We have a conference on central bank independence in 10 days. But it becomes crazy. I don't know how that's Sciences Po, but to get people into Sciences Po, we're having to make all these announcements and then pick them up at the entrance and get them to the room. And I'm also saying this for you, Sophia, yeah? Let's make sure we we get you into this. Crazy. That's right. Hello.
Yes, security is surprisingly strong at Sionspor.
Yeah. Luckily enough, we're not yet like at the airport, huh? Yeah. Not like at the ECB or whatever. So, yeah. Can I have a hand up of persons who've already been to the seminar before? So Amir and David, you haven't been here before, or?
No, this is my first time.
Oh, great, then we hope we make you a repeat visitor.
Well, I'm sure this will be the case.
Yeah. And David, you too new or?
My first time too. I'm actually just started with the Center for Political Economy, Matthias. We've been emailing.
Ah, yes, yes, that's right. And I think I've seen Robert Meister before, and but not sure about the others. Of course, Perry, and then yeah. Should I send a reminder to Ben? Okay. Ali. How's life at Columbia? A bit calm now? Calmer or not?
Yes,
Yeah.
a lot calmer.
Yeah, I think because the office is a little bit separated from the main campus, you're kind of a little bit separated from the kind of main, freshman week undergrad craziness. But yeah,
So no encampments yet.
Not yet.
Not that we've heard of.
It's yeah. I don't want to play crystal ball, but I think next time we meet, this is my guess. Just a guess. But
Yeah, we'll see.
I remember last semester was amazing. I had to travel to 2 hours to a campus, and every time when I was halfway there, I got an email telling me that I shouldn't come because the campus is closed because the students are protesting.
Oh
And
no.
that was 7:45 in the morning in Paris. I was like 7:45 in Paris. I was like, thanks.
Got it. Cool. I'll turn around. Oh, that's not good.
Ouais. Hey,
Hello.
ça va?
Fine. Ouais, très bien.
Very good, very good. And again, this beautiful office of yours.
Yes, thanks. The sound is good or?
Yes, it's perfect.
Yeah.
Actually.
Excellent.
So in terms of the center, for those of you who are in New York or around, so that is Barry, William, David, Catherine, and Amr too, or not? Yes. So there will be more, there will also be a few in-person events this year. This is the big innovation this year. We're not only having Zoom, but actually the Center for Political Economy work stream on money and finance is becoming an actual human being thing also. But that information will be circulating soon.
That's great news.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. I mean, we have William now and Dario, who's also going to join us in a second, I think, as postdocs who are working on these topics and who will also present soon
yeah.
on their work. And then yeah, get a community of people working together on this at Columbia would be just amazing. Columbia and surroundings. We're thinking big here.
Yeah.
Is this going to be open for external visitors as well? Like
Yeah,
people
of
coming
course.
from Albany, for example?
Of course. And I mean, the big dream would be also if we can get people from, I mean, we had Viral from NYU, was amazing. But if you can also get maybe people from the New School. Although I don't know, do people work on money and finance at the New School these days?
There are a few. I know Quentin Bruneau does more sort of historical money and finance work, but he does excellent work is at the New School.
Okay. I mean, I remember Duncan did this, no, Perry, you did this great piece in Duncan Foley's Festschrift, right? On the hierarchy of money thing, if I remember correctly. Long time.
Yes, that was just the second lecture I give in my undergraduate money and banking class turned into an academic paper. So it was
I enjoyed it.
when they have Festschrifts, that's what you can say, what do I have that I can polish up quickly?
Oh. Hey Mark, how are you? Great to almost see you. Great to see your picture.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Yeah.
All right. Great. Great, Mark, that you could also make it.
Interesting stuff, you know.
Good. Good, good.
I heard you were going to send checks out to everyone who attended.
Yeah, but these are IOUs.
Well,
Signed by me, myself, and I. So
all money is IOUs, so we'll take what we can get.
you just need to get it accepted.
Yes, by someone else when I try to pass it off.
Exactly. Or I'll send you my book and you can try to get the price that Cambridge asks for it. But yeah, no. It's cool. Anush is also there. Oh, that's cool. Look at that. So amazing.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Nathan. And how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Hey, Matthias. Hey, Anush.
Hey, some familiar faces.
Nathan, you look very Parisian with your scarf.
Oh, it's Edinburgh. It's really cold. I've been working from home all day and freezing. I need to dig out my hats from the closet as well.
Okay. All right. Great.
Let's give it a few more minutes. I think people are still coming in.
Hey, Sebastian. Ça va?
Hi everyone, yeah, ça va bien et toi?
Ça va très bien. All right.
Okay, maybe I just get started and say some general remarks. Then maybe in the meantime people can come in. And then we'll start. So first of all, thank you so much for coming to this session and maybe coming back from last year. So this is the seminar series that we organized from the Money and Finance Lab of the Center for Political Economy at Columbia University. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce to you, in addition to Matthias Thiemann, who most of you will know, he chaired with me the session series last year and will chair this one actually. We also have now two postdocs, and Dario and William, if I can briefly just ask you to wave. They're working with us on issues related to money and finance, and of course are pursuing their own research as well. Last year, we started a series on the political economy of liquidity. So we were trying to find topics that basically cut deep into the relationship between power and finance, and to allow us to get a little bit more of a handle of the question of what is the political economy of liquidity, and what is the relationship, of course, between markets and the state. Let me just say, those of you coming in, just mute yourself, and then you can speak once you've been called on during our session later on. And I think Catherine is handling that as well. Thank you. So this year we decided to pursue a similar topic, to go a little bit deeper. We used another kind of subtitle. We're asking the question of who governs finance. And we have already lined up 3 sessions for the fall. You can see them on our website. I think they have been distributed to all the people who have registered for this event as well. We might announce them again at the end of the session. But without further ado, I'm going to hand this now over to Matthias to introduce the topic for this session and to introduce our two speakers. I just want to say hello to Benjamin and Sophia as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Matthias.
Yes, thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to start again. The fall has come, and here we are with the topic of monetary sovereignty and global bond markets, which might sound like an old hat, especially if you remember the discussions of the 90s and 2000s. But we decided to revisit this issue for several reasons. And this is maybe a little bit also of a European concern, but I hope that the non-Europeans in the Zoom room will tend and get to appreciate this and also maybe see how it can be applied elsewhere. We want to think about how nation states can actually issue their public debt in the context of the return of austerity. And austerity is a particular theme that is very big in the country where I'm right now, where Ben is also, which is France. And but at the same time, in the paradox after COVID, where we've all come at least to think that central banks will be there to finance governments in case they have these needs for deficit financing. And so trying to understand the actual return of austerity as it announces itself in Europe in the context of what seems to be the possibility of central banks just to keep financing whatever they want. And so it's my great pleasure that we have today these two speakers that really can speak to this, and they will give each 15 minutes of PowerPoint presentations about how they approach the topic, how they think about this. And then, as always, we open up for debate, and I can already see that we have really amazing people in the room. So I think it's going to be an amazing discussion. And so we're going to start with Zsofia Barta, who is currently still at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy in Albany. But very soon, I'm very happy to say, it's going to become my colleague at Sciences Po Paris. And she's working on credit rating agencies, on sovereign debt from a social constructivist perspective. And her most recent book that I can recommend to all of you, that is called Rating Politics, Sovereign Credit Ratings and Democratic Choice in Prosperous Developed Countries, has just come out at Oxford University Press. And so she will give us her take on the topic of monetary sovereignty. And then Benjamin Lemoine, who is an amazing French colleague, if I may say so. I mean, he's not at Sciences Po, but he's in Paris, and he's doing a great work on debt and the social order that surrounds that, and why and how debt is enforced upon countries, and how this is an interplay between treasury markets and the financial markets, in particular with the case of France. But that's enough from my side, because they will tell you all that you need to know about their takes. And so here, Zsofia, if you want, please, you can take it away from here.
Thank you very much, Matthias and Katarina. It's a pleasure to contribute to this seminar series, and I'm going to try to share my slides. Please let me know if you can see it.
Yeah.
Great. So thanks again. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that I can live up to the introduction that Matthias gave, because the way I see my talk is that it's actually kind of a bridge between the previous seminar series and this one, because what I'm going to talk about today is the constraints that markets for sovereign debt impose on the governments that try to finance themselves on those markets. And like so many of the speakers before me, I started my preparations by reviewing past sessions, and I learned an immense amount about liquidity and monetary sovereignty. And at first sight, it might seem that what I'm going to talk about today is a very different kettle of fish, but I will seek to show that constraints on government's political and policy choices arising from government debt is actually integrally related to questions of market liquidity, monetary sovereignty, and macrofinance that were discussed in this seminar so far. So my research has long focused on the question of to what extent governments in the global north are constrained in their political and policy choices by the fact that they have to fund themselves from bond markets. And there is, of course, a rich literature on this, and it mostly claims that financial markets impose constraints on governments by charging higher interest rates when a government's policies are perceived to undermine solvency. But what I'm going to argue today is that the interest that governments have to pay also depends on market perceptions of how their bonds would be treated in a liquidity crisis. In other words, I argue for a macro-financial perspective on the issue of constraints on political and policy choices. So I will briefly start by describing the standard story of bond market constraints, where the price of bonds is determined as a function of perceived solvency risk. Then I will move on to the alternative story, which emphasizes that government bonds, particularly in the global north, also function as safe assets in financial markets, and therefore perceptions of liquidity risk matter a lot for bond prices. I will briefly digress to discuss the problem with identifying safe assets and explain the role that credit ratings play in certifying assets whose liquidity is low enough to function as safe assets. And I will explain that credit ratings conceptualize liquidity as a country-specific degree of susceptibility to market panics, which in turn is understood as the ability to retain market confidence in times of market anxiety. Finally, I will explain that this ability to retain confidence is operationalized as a set of political and policy features that promise to enable governments to carry out decisive austerity or the monetization of debt when markets are jumpy. And as a result of this, ratings assign significant penalties and rewards to certain political and policy features. So let me start with the standard story, which is often discussed under the moniker of market discipline. So this view implicitly starts from the microeconomic assumption that rational investors price bonds as a function of the expected present value of debt servicing. Therefore, any doubts about solvency translate into a lower bond price and higher yield. That is, any governmental choices perceived to undermine solvency are associated with worse financial conditions. But this literature remains ambiguous. Whether this means only that markets care about the evolution of the debt to GDP ratio or sustainability, or they actually place more thoroughgoing constraints on what politics and policies guarantee longer-term solvency. Danny Roderick argued for the latter, claiming that countries would be placed in a golden straitjacket, whereas Lena Mosley concluded that, especially in the global north, governments would only need to keep headline figures of deficit, debt, inflation in order, and they would have more room to move in their substantive policy choices. What this perspective ignores is that government bonds, especially in the global north, are often not only had for their long-term investment value, but are also heavily used as safe assets to secure deals as collateral, serve as reserves, nest eggs, or as the IMF eloquently put it, as a lubricant or substitute of trust in financial transactions. And as we know from the literature on safe assets, to serve this function, bonds have to have a certain quality of moneylessness, meaning they have to be reliable stores of value and liquid. And this requirement of constant price and liquidity is what economists often call information insensitivity, meaning that the market-wide expectation is that no piece of new information can surface that would significantly change either price or liquidity. And previous presentations in this series have explained that price stability and liquidity are really two sides of the same coin, because liquidity characterizes the ability of actors to realize the long-term underlying fundamental price. So I'm just going to subsume these criteria under the concept of liquidity. So if we take into consideration the use of government bonds as safe assets, the price of bonds is also going to be a function of perceived reliability of the liquidity of those bonds. The question, of course, is how markets assess the liquidity of bonds. In contrast to a standard investment valuation story, in which prices are determined on the basis of exogenous fundamentals, i.e. a country's perceived performance, prices in a safe asset story actually depend on an endogenous market variable because liquidity depends on investors' willingness to hold the bond. This creates a coordination problem, not just in the abstract sense, how markets deal with the reflexive formation of expectations about liquidity, but also a very concrete logistical problem of how parties involved in different financial transactions can pin down what qualifies as a safe asset, i.e. how they write repo contracts, portfolio mandates, and reserve requirements. And currently, this coordination problem is resolved via the use of credit ratings, which are de facto used as a certification for safe assets. Although ratings technically pass judgment on repayment risk, not on price movement and liquidity, by certifying the degree of safety of future income streams, they implicitly vouch that the likelihood that markets could receive bad enough news for prices to dramatically drop is negligible. In other words, credit ratings make assets information insensitive and thereby enable them to function as safe assets in transactions. And luckily for a researcher like myself, this use of credit ratings for safe asset certification purposes means that the assessment of liquidity is concentrated in the hands of a very few conspicuous market actors that one can just go and ask about their mental frameworks. And if there is interest, I'm happy to describe the empirical strategy that I pursued in finding out about those mental frameworks. But for now, let me just say that credit rating agencies are very focused on the threat of liquidity crises, because they wreak such havoc on credit ratings from time to time, and they wreak such havoc on the authority of rating agencies. And therefore, assessing a bond issuer's vulnerability to such crises is an absolutely central part of credit rating analysis. So credit rating methodologies conceptualize liquidity as vulnerability to panic, which is an interesting mental model that combines two fairly contradictory elements. On the one hand, it consists of a semi-Minskian approach, which acknowledges that shocks, or as Minsky would put it, not unusual surprise events, can drive nervous investors to unleash reflexive dynamics that wipe out the liquidity from certain segments of the market. Yet, on the other hand, this framework still lays the responsibility for falling victims to such panic at the feet of governments, arguing that governments that pursue the right mix of policies don't lose the confidence of markets. This mental framework is spelled out throughout the sovereign credit rating methodologies, but let me read you a very short section from Standard & Poor's 2012 methodology that most succinctly summarizes this idea. It says, since the beginning of the 19th century, most sovereigns defaults have occurred because of the defaulting government's past policies left it ill-prepared to face an unexpected turn of events. Following a shock, when a government's previous fiscal or monetary policies leave it little room for maneuver, or when economic policies do not support sustainable economic growth, investors' perceptions tend to change quickly. This, in turn, raises financing costs and, in some cases, leaves a government with default as the preferred policy response. In other words, they say, well, shocks happen, but governments should be prepared to respond to shocks decisively and avert panic by doing whatever it takes. So when is a government well prepared for an unexpected turn of events? And since the objective is to maintain market confidence in any market storm, the sovereign rating methodologies tell us that governments should be able to carry out decisive enough austerity and or monetary financing of debt without creating inflationary pressures in order to restore the confidence of markets that the effects of the unforeseen shock would be reversed. Accordingly, credit rating methodologies talk incessantly about the need to maintain fiscal and monetary flexibility at all costs. And while maintaining fiscal and monetary flexibility might sound fairly anodyne, those two notions actually entail really thoroughgoing interference with countries' political and policy choices. For example, rating agencies look very negatively on taking on spending commitments that are difficult to reverse in the short run, such as entitlement spending, particularly pensions and unemployment spending, because they feel like that stops governments from imposing a swift authority. On the other hand, actually, more easily changeable spending is quite okay with rating agencies, because they see that kind of spending as a buffer that can be cut in hard times. Rating agencies also demand that countries should be able to raise taxes easily when markets are jumpy, which means that there should be some slack left in taxation. Rating agencies look negatively on center-left governments because they think that they might not present an austerity program as convincingly as right-wing governments would. Also, political institutions that hinder decisive decision-making are a negative factor for the same reasons of not allowing decisive enough austerity. And finally, and very interestingly, not having the monetary flexibility to monetize debt without major inflationary pressures is also a major liability. And all of these political and policy features significantly and substantially affect sovereign credit ratings and therefore the interest rates that governments have to pay on their debt. In some, bond markets do impose constraints, penalties, and rewards on political and policy choices, and those constraints are linked to how markets think about liquidity. Markets, or their representatives in this case, credit rating agencies. So by way of conclusion, I wanted to reflect on my starting point where I said that the market discipline view was lacking because it only sees government bonds as long-term investment vehicles priced along a macroeconomic rationality centered on solvency. This view sees some constraints on governments, but it's still kind of a rational type of constraints where the markets and the interests of the markets and governments would be aligned due to this disciplining element. Integrating the safe asset use of government bonds, on the other hand, requires bringing in a macro-financial perspective that recognizes the importance of liquidity and the consequences of market irrationality and liquidity crisis for governments that fund themselves from the market. And what I presented was what I would call, for better or worse, a financial plumbing view, which also takes into consideration the practicalities of how market actors deal with issues of liquidity and pricing in practice and how they deal with their knowledge that markets sometimes behave irrationally. And accordingly, I focused on credit ratings as a key practical solution, which unites the long-term investment aspect with the understanding that safe assets fail in times of liquidity crisis. And I explained that credit ratings impose heavy penalties and rewards on political and policy choices as sort of an insurance against the irrationality that erupts in liquidity crises. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zofia. Just on time, perfect. There's already a question from Nathan, but I think we would first like to go to have Benjamin Lemoine present his 15 minutes, and then it's very good to put questions and we'll revisit them in the order that they come, but I think now the floor is yours, Benjamin.
Thank you very much. Can you see my slides also? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Matthias and Katarina, for this invitation to this great seminar. As Matthias mentioned, I'm now working on the way private creditors are seeking to enforce their debt by any means against global South defaulting states. But I've never really set aside this work that is more dedicated to Eurozone sovereign debt and French sovereign debt. So this presentation is intended to open the black box of the sovereign as a safe asset beyond a number of postulates generally taken for granted in the literature. Indeed, it seems to go without saying that the sovereign debt of central countries in the international financial hierarchy is the risk-free asset per excellence. In many accounts, these sometimes take the form of a feature, a functionality. I want to emphasize how the issuance of a safe asset actually entails a political and social specification, an institutional outfit, and economic policy order. And to grasp this, one needs to enter the schemas that describe the codependence between states and capital markets, to grasp the quality of political and institutional linkage and relations, rather than measuring and comparing the quantity of public spending in relation to GDP, as already Zofia explained. One needs also to describe what this codependence does to the space of the possible and the thinkable in political economy option. Okay, sorry. The recent French election were an interesting moment of institutional experimentation. I will, in this presentation, rely on the French case as an entry to the Eurozone macro-financial structure. If France is at the center of the Eurozone and OAT, Obligation Assimilable du Trésor, the French bonds, are a kind of another benchmark to the safe asset, since the bond is becoming scarce due to the debt brake policy in Germany. The electoral sequence, the recent electoral sequence, as you may have heard about, has given rise to a great deal of financial speculation on the value of the safe asset on the secondary market, the French safe asset. It has also given rise to technocratic, institutional, and political speculation. JP Morgan, the bank JP Morgan, has carried out his own test just before the election based on polls of voting intention. Polls which turns out to be wrong, that is not so unusual, since it was the left-wing coalition which came out on top, depriving the far-right party, the Rassemblement National in France, of the relative majority, which was nevertheless considered in this projection as the most likely, as you can see. In any case, the market had taken it as highly unlikely that the Rassemblement National, the Marine Le Pen far-right political party, would engage in a fiscal policy that was confrontational with European institutions. The hypothesis of a left-wing government seeking to increase fiscal resources to offset public spending by breaking with supply-side policy and fiscal and budgetary support for private enterprise was not only considered unlikely, but also highly undesirable. The markets would have had very little appetite at auction for debt securities issued in the name of this break with the current macroeconomic framework. Just before the result of this French parliamentary election, the European Central Bank negotiations were taking place over the fate of the range of tools the ECB now has at its disposal. Its lender of last resort capacity by repurchasing bonds on the secondary market. If, for reason of Eurozone financial stability, that is to say preserving commercial banks' portfolio and repo markets, it seemed out of the question to let France collapse or suffer speculative attacks without reacting. Everything hinged on the timing and sequence with which the stabilizing force, this capacity of the ECB to nip market speculation in the bud, that is to break with the disciplinary power of bond market, was going to be engaged. The question was, at what point in time, in what sequence, with what leverage on the next French government domestic budgetary choices? Ironically, as I show in this slide, in this quote, and as I will present in the chronology in the coming slide, it was the governor of the Greek Central Bank who explained that he did not want to destroy the fiscal discipline role of capital market. Yanis Tournaras here. So I will try to develop a brief chronology of the, let's say, the intrication between Treasury and European Central Bank across the time, and to develop more on the way technocracy complements the institutional failures of markets to ensure discipline and instill virtuous and what it considers as reasonable behavior. As you may know very well, the road to Maastricht criteria and Eurozone construction in 1980s and 2000, there were a configuration where it was self-evident that central bank need to be independent from the Treasury Department, that direct financing by central bank was prohibited, and fiscal discipline was guaranteed through statistical surveillance by the European Commission and Eurostat. It was considered that the technocracy would have to complement a market that was failing itself to ensure fiscal discipline. What was realized, there were no sanctions enforced against government that had deviated from it, including Germany and France in 2005. But these criteria and this surveillance played a huge role by being present in the media and the political scene and public debate. Numbers were performing what is thinkable and feasible in economic and social terms. In 2010, Jean-Claude Trichet took a lot of time before accepting the ECB role of lender of last resort. Greek spread interest rates were allowed to soar, while recalcitrant governments were punished. It was the case of Syriza 1 and 2, and the ECB threatened to cut off liquidity to Greek banks. It's only once the Troika mechanism has been set in motion that the ECB decided to cross the Rubicon and buy up the sovereign debt of peripheral countries within the framework of the SMP. The sequences of stages and sequences of action by public authorities matter a lot. As a member of Troika, the ECB uses these limited buybacks to put pressure on governments, even if it means contributing to their downfall. For example, it was the case of the letter sent to Berlusconi and Zapatero in summer 2011. The next configuration, whatever it takes, the Mario Draghi 2012, where the ECB launched a program of unlimited sovereign debt purchases from any country that agrees to sign a memorandum of understanding with the ECM. Never activated, this program was sufficient to extinguish the fire and limit contagion. A few years later, the ECB implemented the program. It massively bought sovereign debt of the Eurozone country on the secondary market. Here again, however, the ECB plays a political game. Greek debt is excluded from this program at the time on the grounds of its poor credit rating, while the Tsipras government is desperately trying to loosen the stranglehold of joint pressure from the financial market and the Troika. In 2016, Benoît Cœuré, a former French ECB board member, was giving a theory of the Eurozone sovereign debt as a safe asset, with an ambiguity still. He said, we need public debt to be safe in the Eurozone. It is vital to the functioning of the financial system, analogous to the function of money in the real economy. It enables government to play the rightful role in stabilizing the economy, which is essential to the institutional design of our monetary union. But Cœuré adds, at the same time, we don't want public debt to be perceived as too safe, as this would eliminate the disciplinary role of the market in implementing sustainable policies and create a false belief that government cannot default or fail. So he concluded sovereign debt must be made safe by sound fiscal policy rather than being assumed to be safe. This ambiguity will remain and seems to me central. It continued to exist during the management of the pandemic of the COVID-19. The bazooka deployed by the ECB was constructed as a parenthesis. As the first confinement are decreed in Europe, interest rates on Italian sovereign debt are soaring. Asked whether the ECB would support the country, Christine Lagarde replied that the ECB was not here to close the spread between Italy and what was considered as austerity frugality countries. In the days that follow, the ECB made a turn on that and launched a massive sovereign debt repurchase program on the secondary market, thereby stabilizing rates and assuming the role of last resort. As you can see, after 4 years of stability and growth suspension, the transmission protection instrument reintroduced the conditionality of the activation of this instrument for the ECB. So what is important is the technocratic reproduction of market discipline. There is no brutal reversal between different sequences, but a continuity and variation, micro-variation. The critical macrofinance approach which describe the co-evolution of private finance and the macro institution of the state is taken here seriously. That means, if we consider it on a sociological point of view, that one type of political agency, a specific scope of political option, is possible and compatible with one another kind of public-private financial plumbing. So timing and justification mean a lot. Texture and fine grain of the plumbing matter. What happens in the interval before the lender of last resort kicks in? At which condition? I use the Daniela Gabor diagram in this very good seminar last season, where she developed the metaphor of the iceberg, where you can see the visible aspect of thing and the, let's say, the infrastructure that is much less visible. So I want to connect the tips and the tail of the iceberg. the sovereign bond market, that is to say the sovereign bond market, the public narrative on the debt catastrophe that one can hear in the public debate, especially here in France, it's like every day in the news, and the financial engineering, the plumbing of the repo market and collateral factory. The postulate is that worlds are different, but they're also connected. One has to analyze which type of state is de-risking finance and go beyond the idea of state capacity of buying time and avoiding political blame through sovereign borrowing mechanism, where the tendency might be to consider that codependence between state and capital market goes with a kind of fiscal and social peace, an institutional equilibrium where any kind of economic policy, left or right, a policy that's making pro-business can be financed under the same very good and quiet condition. So a political sociology approach of the economy describes the factory of the sovereign financial signature or its creditworthiness is made in different social space. I rely on different works on financialization. I do not develop there. And I consider democracy as the way this crossroad between the plumbing and the public space are organized, distributed, and justified. So the safe asset laboratory, I developed this metaphor where the Treasury Department and its civil servants are developing, are designing and creating possible worlds. It goes against the idea, as Sophia developed, of neutrally, of financing vehicles that will be neutral, and rediscovering Treasury officials and following and describing how they develop a kind of spontaneous anthropology, building a fair world, organizing society and administration. For instance, I'm quoting Jacques de la Rosière, who is a famous figure of the noblesse d'État in France, noblesse d'État financière, and he was considering the ECB quantitative easing effect producing negative interest rate as an anomaly in the social world. That's something I've never experienced before. In my opinion, positive interest rates are a fundamental benchmark for society, and maintaining negative rates for a long time will be a major mistake. To tell people who make the effort to put money aside for the hazard of life, for their old age, for their children, that they're doing to lose out is to overturn social law. So it's very interesting because while he's considering the organization of the financial plumbing, is also developing a vision of what are the social law, what are the social fundamentals for the world. This is, I have to be quick now, I'm sorry, but my work goes back in the history after the Second World War and developing another plumbing, another way of organizing treasury, central banks, but also the credit in the economy was also going with another philosophy of state role in the economy and state legitimate organization of political economies. Here you can see that there were a plurality of available instruments that were market and non-market, and also the recourse to deposit against the recourse to debt, against the recourse to borrowing to private agent exterior from the state. And the main way of financing was money-driven and deposit-driven. In the post-war period, it went with a political philosophy of a dirigist debt, where the finance minister no longer asked for favor. Here I'm quoting a finance minister in the interwar who considered that the creditworthiness of the state is produced through financial newspaper. Just after, after the Second World War, against this consideration, public technocrats were even considering that the state were becoming a juridical fiction, that the state does not exist anymore because public financial mechanisms were so extensive that the technocrats were considering that the very idea that there is a clear boundary between the state, the financial public state sector and private finance was not self-evident at all. Years later, 30 years later, sorry, I'm using here an example of what I want to develop, the crossroad, an example of this crossroad between state technocrats and financial market. It's an extract from a roadshow led by JP Morgan with the in hand with the French Treasury, and the bank was explaining why investing in France. Why do you have to choose France in order to choose France as a safe asset in order to put your money? And the bank JP Morgan was developing a list of the economic fundamentals that make France a very attractive place to invest. A free trade economy, a non-inflationary policy stance, high unemployment, considered as a guarantee of pressure on low wages and competitive labor cost, tight, rigorous fiscal policy, the strength of France's major corporation, etc. To summarize, a package of social, political, and technical promises. Here, just for fun, is an example of the sales brochure for the bonds promoted at the time. France was talking about a revolution, and you see here a combination between modernity and tradition, where you have the solidity of the state embodied by the bust of a great finance minister, Colbert, and the modernity and liquidity of the market embodied here by, that's the funny part, a levitating Reuters monitor. To go to the conclusion with another example of election and auction in 1987, it's still in the presentation made by JP Morgan, is presenting to private investor the political risk that could go with investing in French safe asset or not. And the slide is saying, I remind you, moreover, that it was a socialist government in France under President Mitterrand which began the deregulation and liberalization of the French financial market in 1984. Regardless of who wins, the French bond market will not suffer. This roadshow presentation of France by JP Morgan, who is generally co-produced with the Treasury civil servant, emphasizes the alignment between the political agency of the Treasury, but also the promise made over the whole society and the market infrastructure. This is this precise alignment that produce the safe asset and what the safe asset is all about. Matthias, you can tell me, or maybe I'm going to the end of the talk, or many minutes?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. So maybe I'm going to conclude with a last configuration, the more recent one, that is the COVID configuration. As you can see on the schema, the graph below, from 2019, the interest rate in France for the 10 years bond was going negative. There was no problem of financing. And what was fascinating for me is that when sovereign financing is easy and unproblematic, that becomes a problem for French technocracy. And there is a whole range of action that is keen to preserve the debt narrative. And this is a good way to conclude my talk, that the narrative of public debts on the public debate are absolutely not disconnected from the plumbing. And there was, during the COVID parentheses, a public debate that was surrounded by the idea that one need to cancel the debt owed by the ECB. That can be curious to you, but that was really one big topic, and Christine Lagarde even had to answer to that. The French minister Bruno Le Maire also, and the answer was a special solution. Because there were analogy with war. We had to go into war against COVID and to deploy a lot of public money in order to do that. There was a fear, especially at the Bank of France, and the central bank, that war anesthetized market economy because monetary and fiscal policy are subversion to military spending, creating a situation of excess liquidity for private agents. The post-war awakening can be fatal to recovery. So there was the idea that if the wars, the analogy with war, opened the scope of possible relationship between state and markets, and we have to face, as technocrats, we have to face with the idea of canceling debt, of the return to an administrated mode of debt issuing, we have to reaffirm the idea of financial fiscal discipline and the way that market discipline matter. And we have to prepare people minds to this return to normalcy. And so amortization was a device that was invented exactly as a kind of compromise. Like we can earn time and shape a solution that will distinguish between the COVID debt, in a special account that will be considered as exceptional, as something exogenous, and what will be the bad debt, the structural social spending, the financing of public servants, the long-term public commitment, as Sophia was explaining. And so amortization was an intermediary way when you give you sometimes you create this special account and then you can reimburse, but with a long-term agenda. And then it gives you breath in order to do austerity in the midterm, but not in the very short term. So I will conclude on that, on the importance, the matter, the fine grain of the macro financial plumbing and the importance of the institutional separation and boundaries that are managed by technocrats. And this is an interview I had with a central banker that explained to me that monetary policy lives its own life. If during the COVID, you could have the impression that central bank policy, monetary policy, could be linked to sovereign debt. It was just a view of the mind. And explained to me, it just so happened that in the circumstance, in the face of the crisis, we felt that it was something that needed to be done to reinforce the action of the state. But these are two different things. In other words, it also means that there comes a day when it stops. That's another story. To say that monetary policy comes as a backup to fiscal policy or to the public debt strategy, no, that's a view of the mind. So to conclude, the lender of last resort role of the central bank is not a given. Sequencing and justification matters a lot. The circuit and instrument of intervention matter for organizing or not roadshow scenes, the auction, the preparation of roadshow as decisive and strategic sites. That is to say, the public-private co-production of market and fiscal discipline, distinguishing between illegitimate and illegitimate political economic choice. Macrofinance produce schemes of reality, a division between, on the one, what is available to the public debate, figures and number, and what is connected but less known, or deliberately made invisible or uncontroversial, that is to say, the macro-financial plumbing. Thank you for your attention and sorry for being a bit long.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that was really a very, very inspiring talk by both of you. I do have a few questions. So we already have Nathan had a question. If as for those of you who haven't been here yet, exactly just as Anna does, raise your hand and we'll call upon you. So I would like to then ask maybe Nathan and Anna to pose their question, and then I have mine maybe. So Anna and then Nathan, that's fine with you? Or Nathan?
Well, Nathan was first. So
Nathan, please.
Oh, all right, yeah, sure, if that's okay. So really quick question, probably a clarification one more than anything profound. So in your presentation, you developed the idea of the irrational as connected to the liquidity risk in terms of the classifications given by rating agencies. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean by irrational and according to which set of assumptions and models? Because just from a kind of layman perspective, viewing your presentation, there didn't seem necessarily anything irrational at work here, but I'm sure there are various kind of priors or so forth in economic theory which is structuring your thinking there. Thank you.
are we going in a group or are they?
Yeah, Anna, please.
Great.
Yes.
So just a really couple of comments and a question. So the first one is for Benjamin. I'm wondering whether you're conflating safe assets and safer assets. Because what you seem to be talking about, particularly with JP Morgan, is relative credit risk rather than information insensitivity, which is what Sophia was focusing on. And this has a history with JP Morgan's father buying the French bonds of the Paris Commune and whatnot. But it's a different bird. For Sophia and both of you, I'm fascinated by the focus on the rating agencies and the treasuries and the central banks, because the idea that any given institution can determine the safety of an asset strikes me as kind of underselling the complexity of the ecosystem. And I'm especially grateful, Benjamin, for your raising the Correa speech, which is like literally my biggest moment of fame, because he used our typology and somewhat misused it for making assets safe, guaranteeing them and labeling them as safe, right? Which are really three rather different things that could be done by different institutions. And then it works very differently domestically and externally, right? So if you have a hermetically sealed economy, every asset is safe, but who has that luxury? And then also the European safe asset move, right? The red bond, blue bond interlude, and the fact that it originated in France is sort of fascinating, given the current circumstances. So again, really, the question is, how many institutions do you need to do what to create a safe asset? And can we really pin it on any one of them? Thank you.
Yeah, I think then now Sophia and Ben, if you would like to respond, and then we'll take the next round of questions. That works for you.
Thank you both. So in response to Nathan, I basically just wanted to use irrationality as a counterpoint to the microeconomic assumption of rationality. So basically what I was getting at is, in the market discipline view, there is a rationality to why those different policy choices and political choices that are being disciplined or penalized. In what sense does that make sense for the investors to penalize them, right? So there is a rationality of an expected present value valuation. And I basically use the term irrationality as a counterpoint to that, because it arises from that kind of Minskian panic-driven phenomenon when markets melt down and liquidity dries up and safe assets collapse. So of course there is a very strong rationality on part of these technical solutions by credit rating agencies, and that's exactly the beauty of it, of how there is an acknowledgement and a recognition that those situations in which safe assets collapse tend to be not driven by actual new information, but how markets irrationally respond to new information. And there is this market reflexivity that creates these self-fulfilling crises and self-fulfilling vicious circles. And so I basically use the term irrationality to kind of make a counterpoint to the original view of where market discipline comes from. And in that sense, it's very interesting that you are asking this, but also what Benjamin was talking about in terms of, he said that the ECB is trying to technocratically reproduce market discipline. So it's really important that in that framework, you need market discipline, or you are supposed to leave countries exposed to market discipline, because in a sense it comes from this source of rational thinking, and in that sense the long-term interests of countries and the investors' conception of pricing are parallel to each other. And what I was trying to show is that, on the other hand, those constraints that are imposed by, for example, rating agencies come from a place of being exposed to the irrational workings of markets and being exposed to those self-reinforcing crises that have relatively little to do with what governments are otherwise doing in their policies. I hope that answers the question. And very interesting question from Anna in terms of how many institutions do you need to label and guarantee safe assets. So I would say that in the case of credit ratings, it's definitely the labeling that counts. But in a sense, by freezing the assessment of future liquidity, credit rating agencies also kind of stop. I think this this term information insensitivity is particularly important, because basically they say, okay, you have to suspend the processing information for our sakes, because otherwise we will never be able to do these deals. We would never be able to write repo contracts and specify reserve requirements and so on. So in a sense, I'm not even arguing that credit ratings produce or label safe assets. They are just a placeholder to say, okay, for now on, for the time being, we are using this conception of what a safe asset is. And this has a lot to do with also understanding that as soon as this agreement about an asset being safe disintegrates, that is going to cause a major disaster, well, for investors, for the markets, and for the government, but also for credit rating agencies themselves. And that's why there's this insurance element of saying, okay, but governments have to do their best not to get there. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this question. On the safe or safer, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a question of scale, of small differences. It's a question of hierarchy. So the French Treasury always try to compete with Germany in the Eurozone. It's the specific configuration, and it can become a national problem to lose one's place as a second benchmark. And France historically always played the part, the card of a competition on liquidity, because it could never offset in terms of fundamentals on public finance. And so it's very fascinating the way, if I want to go, I would develop a kind of continuum of understanding. As you know, you work a lot on global South countries, of the way Treasury Department are developing devices, contracts, also promises inscribed in the bonds itself, that are not so far from what you can observe in the global South. I mean, for instance, with a colleague, Damien Piron, we studied the case of the Kingdom of Belgium. That is a safe asset in the Eurozone, maybe lower in the European hierarchy, lower than the French Treasury. But you can observe the way there's a competition on liquidity that goes with the development of financial innovation. And for instance, the use of derivatives. For instance, Andrea Alagna worked on that also. But you can observe the way the Kingdom of Belgium, with the help of Merrill Lynch, developed some important innovation that turned out to be very costly for the state, because the conjuncture turns bad. And so you can see, in order to construct liquidity to attract capital, the Belgium state was taking a lot of risk. And for instance, the French Treasury always considered that it was a too risky play, and always say no to banks that were proposing such innovation and such use of derivatives. So there's a kind of also ambivalent role of the French Treasury, trying to be at the top of innovation. For instance, introducing the first in the Eurozone, the first index bond on the inflation before Germany, trying to develop some other innovation in order to compensate the way being the second benchmark, to compensate this rank and to develop more liquidity. On the other question you were asking for the what institutions are needed, my answer will be, it's not so much a question of which institution, but what are these institutions doing? How are they acting? How do these institutions act? And I wanted for that, for instance, to emphasize the importance of the quality of relationship that are in place. And for instance, I wanted to emphasize on the importance of separating between primary and secondary market. That is something that for economists, in the end, they say, okay, it's the same thing, because in the end, the central bank repurchasing bonds on the secondary market. So you can conclude that it's a monetary financing. But I insist on the importance of maintaining these different scenes because, for instance, during the COVID, the roadshow may even seem artificial because you had the bazooka of the ECB that were buying a lot of bonds on the secondary market. The interest rate, despite what was saying Christine Lagarde, were controlled, were capped, but you still had many roadshow. You still had many treasury presentations that were justifying how they were constructing the safe harbor for private investor and how they were developing the best products for them to buy and to invest in. So I would say my answer will be, it's less a question of which kind of institution you need, but how these institutions are behaving.
Great. I mean, so I find there are plenty of paradoxes here, and I would like to first of all thank both of the presenters to just lay out for us, the social construction of what you, Ben, have called the order of debt. I think that's really, really, really important. And I have two questions, and then Anush, I've seen that you are on, so I'll pick you up right away after that. My first question to Ben, a bit provocative, is in your quote, and I mean this, I know this is a quote from Le Monde, but the question that one then needs to ask is how much pain is enough? So some pain needs to be imposed upon these French so that they understand that not everything is possible. But how much pain is enough? And who, of course, this dynamic cannot be controlled by these guys, right? So that's like they're not really fully in control. It's a complex system. And the second question then is, at some point, as you all point out, this fragile machine and so on, that the information insensitive moment cannot be allowed to déraper, like to unfold completely, right? As Sophia just said. So at some point, the central bank will step in and have to say to the system, okay, if I am a rating agency, how do I take this into account in my ratings? Like this mess of, okay, so there will be some discipline imposed and some punishment but at some point the ECB will step in and then so how are you supposed to make sense of this? I mean, the simulacra aspect of this really interests me. That's my part. And then Anush, happy to hear you if you like.
Should I go? Okay. Thanks for a lovely set of presentations, very thought-provoking. It brings me, and reflecting on Anna's question, it makes me think from the Global South perspective, how many, and maybe even from the Global North perspective, we have these missing institutions of an intermediate nature that then create the fragility in the system. Because, to pick up on Sophia's presentation, absolutely liquidity, but where is the liquidity coming from? The liquidity is coming from an ecosystem of market making, right? And if so if you have a deep and robust ecosystem of market makers in any instrument, then that instrument will be liquid. So this is liquidity, if you like, of first resort. But then, of course, you have these massive European central banks and Fed and so on in the global north, who will then be your market maker of last resort, right? But then if you, but even, and Benjamin showed the run on the French debt. What it seems that there's a missing set of market makers even there, which is to say of the institutional type, right? Benjamin is all too familiar with the French, the pre-market, the before state debt was financialized to the extent that it was and made dependent on markets. There were, of course, non-market sources of financing, which were, if you like, patient capital, and these things were held to maturity and so on and so forth. Now that was perhaps too institutionalized, if you like, and not flexible enough, and then the pendulum swung all the way in the other direction, and now it's too marketized, and the institutional only comes in as the kind of, to quote Perry, the market maker of last resort. So it seems that there is an optimum there in terms of system design. So the fragility is excessive marketization. Now, if you look at it from the point of view of the Global South, we have neither of these things. No one is making a deep and liquid markets in Indian debt, I can tell you, as big as an economy as India is, and they will say, oh, that's because you haven't opened up the capital account and so on. and there is no institution to sort of step in and pull the lever and say when the market goes crazy, to kind of say, okay, here's the safe harbor. So Anna, to answer that question, is that there is this. I mean, this of course has been the cry from the new international economic order onwards, is that these institutions are not there, that be them market making institutions or I won't say market breaking institutions, but market suspending institutions that will have, because at the end of the day, the macro financial view is, of course, important. Benjamin is right that the fine grain of the plumbing is important, but if you zoom out, it's ultimately about elasticity and discipline, right? And who's imposing the elasticity and who's or allowing the elasticity and who's imposing the discipline, and for who and when, right? And all those fine distinctions that Benjamin was making out, okay, discipline for this, elasticity for this, et cetera, right? So, but ultimately, and for the global South, we have all too much discipline, and for the global North, it's irrational elasticity, and then the discipline comes in at the end. Sorry, that was more of a comment, but very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anush. And maybe we are so bold to take a last one with Sebastian, and then, if it's okay, Sophia and Ben, you can come in again. Okay, Sebastian?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. Thanks for the two really wonderful presentations. Quick question for Ben, and I realize it's never quite fair to ask about sort of ongoing developments, but I buy very much of the story. I would love to hear your take, though, on how to square your story with what we currently see in terms of quantitative tightening. So until very recently, we would have thought that these entanglements that you describe between the sequencing and between the central banks and the ministries of finance and maybe also the debt agencies, that they are almost, I mean, they become ever more. There's always another crisis around the corner. COVID was, well, if not a war, but currently economies are being put on a war footing. So, we should actually have expected that this is ever harder to disentangle, and yet quite surprisingly, quantitative tightening is happening without some of those, financial market instability consequences that we would have expected. So I guess it's an impossible question to answer, but what will we make of this? So until very recently, I would have said this quote that you had from the central banker, it's just the state of the mind. It can stop whenever we want. I would have said that's bollocks. And now we see actually they can disentangle themselves, perhaps surprisingly. I'm just curious for any thoughts on that.
We're getting into the impossible to answer but really interesting questions. So let's hear your answers to those. Whoever wants to go first,
I think most of the questions were actually for Ben, but I wanted to come back to what you were asking about. How does the rating agency take into consideration at what point the ECB is going to say, how much pain is enough? And I have one particular answer for the ECB itself. I don't have a generalized answer of when they think central banks would step in, at what point will central banks stabilize the economy. But I think there's a really interesting inflection point when it comes to rating agencies. So originally, I think all three rating agencies, so Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch, all looked at the monetary union or membership in the euro as a positive factor, because they basically assumed that all of those bonds would be bailed out. And then right after the financial market, that effect switched into negative. So basically it was a learning experience, a learning curve for rating agencies themselves, because they assumed a perfect bailout and they were very happy with that. And then they kind of misjudged in terms of how much pain the ECB would impose. And then when they realized that they would actually go much farther than expected, then the monetary union suddenly becomes a very negative factor after 2008. So I think that's the practical answer for that. But I think it's also a question of what sort of central bank it is that interferes. And so this is also the answer to Anush's question, that a central bank that has a reserve currency and is able to intervene in the markets without actually generating a weakening of the currency and the inflationary pressure is a much better guarantee, of course, than just any central bank. So that aspect of monetary flexibility that I talked about is, on the one hand, do these countries have their own central banks? So that's why the monetary union has become a negative factor, but also whether the monetary authority is actually able to change the situation significantly enough without actually imperiling the currency itself. And in terms of Anush's comment, I 100% agree that I think the global south is affected by both of these issues. That it's that the market is much more sensitive to these movements and to panics, and there is no credible lender of last resort in each case.
Okay, Ben, thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. Maybe Matthias, I'll start with you about the debt order. What is fascinating is that the expression was not only mine or became appropriated by some actors. I was talking with an important former Treasury executive during the pandemic who had read my work, and he was asking to me, for you, what is the alternative? Because you're talking about history, you're talking about former configuration where the sovereign debt was administrated, where there was a kind of financial repression, where the auction were administratively controlled, etc., etc. And so he asked me, for you, what is the alternative? Is it the return of that? And so my answer was very naive and say, no, the alternative is actually happening with the ECB bazooka and repurchasing on the secondary market and calming down, nipping in the bud any kind of market discipline attempt or financial speculation. And he said, no, the debt order will come back, etc. So it was fascinating to me to see how this market discipline was important for this technocrat. And so Anush asked who is responsible in the end for this fiscal discipline. In fact, you cannot separate between state and the market, because what I was analyzing is that you have the same beliefs of what is legitimate to do, the same belief of what state should do in capital market and in the technocracy. And that is a sociological enigma, is that you cannot differentiate between one agency or the other. Like it could go with the hypothesis of Ben Brown, the infrastructural power. You can complete this hypothesis by analyzing the representation of the social world and the financial world by this very agent in the public of the private sector. I wanted also to answer on your provocative question of how much pain is enough. I think it's a very good one, because it's you can answer to that by a kind of sociological definition of what is sustainability, what is debt sustainability. And Anna Gelper knows a lot, because when there is too much pain, it can become a political risk, because what? You have a revolution, you have people in the streets, and then you have real political risk. The political risk become real. Before it was something in order to alert public opinion, and now it becomes real because you have another regime, and the other regime can be quite flexible on the promises that were made before to financial creditors. So indeed, you have a kind of management of the punishment that is not conscious, that is something that is distributed, that is diffuse, but that exists. And for instance, the way it materialized in credit agency, I remember during the Emmanuel Macron, the French president, implemented 2 years ago an important pension reform in France, social pensions, that was extending the age of retirement. And it was a very painful reform to impose. And the reaction of the main credit rating agency was very interesting, because they were integrating the way that the government used too much political capital in that reform. And because there was a huge protestation in the streets, and they considered that Macron had used all his political credit toward the population, and then he will be blocked and he will not able to do another required structural reform to preserve the safe asset in the long run. To be short, the reform was bad because he used too much capital credit on it, too much capital on this reform. So they were, in a way, integrating the midterm or long-term risk, political risk of having a too painful reform that was badly designed or badly conceived and badly implemented because it was imposed by force to the population. And now you will see in the French Parliament, even with this very unstable situation with a relative majority on all sides, you will see maybe the pension reform will be the very next victim of this political instability. But to me, that was one element of answer, is that the credit agency rating are when they do political risk assessment, they're integrating the capital credit, the political capital of the governments, and that's something that is done for the global south for years. It's a totally evident thing. The question of Sebastian that is quite interesting on the possibility to disentangle quantitative tightening from sovereign financial stability. My answer will be that it's still in the political risk. I mean, because what I didn't have so much time to develop is that before the return of quantitative tightening, there was a preparation. What I developed about amortization was a very important work of preparation of mind in order to prepare them to quantitative tightening, and progressively the change of the portfolio of the central bank and the holdings of government bonds that were progressively decreasing, and there were a need to prepare public opinion to hard times and to structural adjustment. And actually in France, we're totally locked in that. Like, I mean, when the government of left was a very moderate, actually, government. They just wanted to have a balanced budget by increasing taxes. It was not the return of nationalization. There was no such thing in the platform. It was only increasing taxes, and it was not acceptable at all. And so I think the source of financial instability for sovereign will really be located now in the political risk in one of the main countries of the Eurozone, that is to say, France, actually.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions at least. We have Dario and William, but we also have Nathan, who brings up the LDI crisis in the UK in 2022 and the role of the Bank of England. And I know that somebody in the Zoom room is working on this, but first let's have Dario and William if they would like so to ask their questions or their comments.
I have a couple of questions for Sophia. So thank you so much for your presentations to both of you. I was intrigued by your role of the credit agencies. So I have one clarification and one provocative question. The clarification is the following. You defined the credit agencies as the information sensitive production agents. I was thinking at them as the opposite, exactly because they produce information, they end up making the underlying fundamental sensitive. So why do you think that the credit agencies end up producing insensitiveness? Because according to the definition by Gordon Ordonez that you brought up, that's exactly when there's opacity. So do you see the credit agencies as producers of opacity? And which brings me to the second question, which is provoking maybe, but how do you feel about the whole personal agenda of these credit agencies? Do you see it as the revolving doors between credit agencies and, I don't know, financial institutions being one of the problems for information insensitiveness? Or do you have another take on that? And another type of question that I have on the safe asset role that I really liked in terms of how to think about public debt. Isn't there an intrinsic contradiction in the eyes of the financial institutions of requiring financial discipline on one side, and on the other side, being eager to have more public debt to be used as collateral and so on and so forth as safe assets? Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so I actually also have a question about rating agencies for Sophia, and specifically, I'm interested in the policy implications of some of the issues that are raised by the ratings you assigned and by your presentation. So if because you highlight in the ratings highlight this sort of disproportionate power maybe that rating agencies have over the state. And so I'm interested if you can see any sort of tangible steps that the state or the regulators might take to realign the business of credit rating and realign the agencies involved in this to perform a more sort of socially beneficial function that they ostensibly serve. Yeah.
Okay, Sophia.
Thank you both so much. Very interesting questions. So to Dario's question about information insensitivity, so I think it is a common misperception that the rating agencies produce information, because at the end of the day they don't really unearth any information that most investors do not have. So the way I see rating agencies more of as a coordination device, because as I said, in the case of pricing, especially when we accept that pricing is not based only on fundamentals, on exogenous variables, but actually there is this reflexive element of what other market actors think. Where do they think the price is going? Where do they think liquidity is going? If you accept that there is a major coordination problem in there, which actually would undermine safe assets from being used, then basically the point of credit ratings is to kind of stop that spiraling of reflexive readjustments of pricing expectations and readjustment of liquidity expectations. And so basically rating agencies or the credit ratings are these longer term variables that kind of capture the information that's already out there, and they pretend that it's possible to kind of make an assumption about the safety of that asset. At the end of the day, at the extreme, obviously, asset safety is a fiction because no asset is perfectly safe. And so credit ratings are kind of the seal of approval. That's why they call it usually a certification function. There is a certification element of saying, for the time being, if you take this asset, which is rated AAA, you can assume that prices and the liquidity are going to be at a level that allows this asset to function as a safe asset. So there isn't really a information production function. It's more of a coordination and kind of like making time stand still for a more substantial period of time during which all of those deals and investments take place. So you were asking about the revolving door, and you said that the part of the reason why rating agencies behave the way they do is because they are very much connected to financial institutions, and that's partly true, but actually much of the rating analyst personnel is more connected to policymakers. So it's very interesting how Benjamin was talking about, that the technocratic elites reproduce market discipline, but in a sense, market discipline also reproduces the thinking of technocratic elites, because very often these people, end up going to the IMF, they end up coming from the IMF, they're very often, going to national administrations, and even their training is very much connected to the same kind of thinking. So very often they would be coming from policy schools rather than straight off finance. So I thought that was an interesting detail that you might want to know about. So William's question about policy implications about the power of credit ratings agencies. So there are two aspects to it. One is whether countries or governments respond to the pressure to, for example, cut back on entitlement programs and try to increase their room for tax increases. So I have a paper out with Alison Johnston, who is my co-author in much of these rating agency projects, and there we find that yes, there is a significant effect of credit rating changes on how countries cut back on the welfare state, basically. So how they cut taxes and cut entitlement spending. So we find a significant effect on that. So that's one aspect. The other one would be what you were asking is whether they would push back against this kind of these constraints. And I think that has two elements. So on the one hand, as Benjamin was emphasizing, that element of discipline is actually very much embraced in most technocratic circles. So governments might not want to push back because they feel like, they are aligned with that element of market discipline. But on the other hand, I also would argue that it would be really, really difficult to replace credit rating agencies, especially because of that information insensitivity production, a coordination function that I was talking about. If you don't have credit rating agencies, it's really difficult to say what would make safe assets or the coordination around safe assets possible. And so on both aspects, we kind of have the more negative outcomes that the governments respond to the pressures on policy, but they do not try to push back. Thank you.
Okay, two more questions. We have Scott and Gaston. Scott, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. And yeah, thanks to two great presentations. I'm just kind of responding to Nathan's prompt about the LDI crisis and where the UK kind of fits into this story. I mean, I'm kind of struggling to formulate what a coherent question would be, but I'm interested to know that the two speakers how they kind of fit the UK experience into their frameworks and how they understand how events kind of unfolded. I mean, in a sense, the UK experience, curiously, is one of kind of observing it. There isn't a liquidity crisis until there's a liquidity crisis sort of thing, because it's one of those highly contingent events, which is so difficult for kind of credit rating agencies to kind of factor in and understand what's going on. I think from my understanding of those events, I think what's interesting that it's really just to flag the Bank of England's doing some quite interesting work, and there's been a couple of papers that have come out. They're talking about lash risk. So this idea of liquidity after solvency hedging risks. So the distinctive feature of pension funds using these strategies, which leads to increased liquidity needs when the value of the hedge falls, even as solvency is improving. So this inverse relationship between solvency and liquidity, and the margin calls that can be triggered when you get these yield spikes. So it's quite an interesting paper. And what they've looked at is the way in which the yield spike, which you see after the Truss mini budget, which by coincidence was 2 years ago today. You see a lot of kind of stuff on Twitter about that at the moment. They've looked at that and they've sort of said that around about 2/3 of the yield spike after the mini budget was caused by the margin calls, by the doom loop, the spiral triggered by these margin calls being triggered. And roughly about a third of the yield spike being driven by bond vigilantes. So they're kind of now trying to work out the dynamics of the particular run that was triggered by that. There's also another interesting bank paper which looks at the role of hedge funds in the days after the yield spike as well. And they are kind of speculating, and they've got some data showing that hedge funds were entirely as you would expect, strategically timing their entry into gilt markets, trying to time the bottom of the doom loop, the collapse of the spiking gilt yields, the collapse in gilt prices, obviously to make as much profit as possible. And that's driving the liquidity spiral as well, because the liquidity's there in a sense, but they're not stepping in, and they're deliberately holding back from stepping in to try and make as much money as possible. So that's kind of driving the liquidity dynamics as well. So I'm interested, particularly Sophie, how that would fit into your your framework, those run dynamics.
Great. And now Gaston, and then last round of answers. Gaston?
Yes, thank you very much for both your presentations. I have a question for Sophia as well. How would you describe or compare the role of index providers in this kind of ecosystem enforcing market discipline? Because I relate a lot of what you said about rating agencies as well on their role in this kind of reflexivity, and would be interested in hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Alors, à vous de jouer.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Scott. I've been actually following your work on the UK crisis because I'm also super interested in this part. And I think the two questions, Scott and Gaston's, kind of play into each other, because I think what's really interesting about credit rating agencies is that they are the interlopers in these crises who do not have a stake who do not have a material stake in the crisis itself, but they have a very important they have a very important stake in terms of their reputational stake in such crises, right? Because basically credit rating agencies see these meltdowns as something that is terribly difficult for the market itself, but it's also it also has the potential of being very damaging for their authority, because in these self-reinforcing liquidity crises, what happens is that because liquidity dries up, the governments that are affected, they're unable to refinance their commitments, and therefore the credit ratings that are initially high have to fall in line with what's happening in the markets in order to catch up with the possibility that default is imminent in a country that might be AAA or AA plus rated. And so in the case of the UK crisis, I think in that sense, credit rating agencies were a stabilizing agent, right? Because rating agencies have to decide whether they jump on a crisis and they try to get ahead of the market and downgrade a bond in order to, not be rating an imminent default AAA, or they hold back and they try to stabilize the market. So in a sense, they always, in every liquidity crisis like this, they have this incredible conflict of whether they think everything is already lost and they should get ahead of the market, or if they only fortify the markets and the confidence of the markets, then they might have a chance of actually stopping the meltdown. So in the case of the UK, I think they behaved fairly responsibly, and they held back. And in a sense, it's also something that characterized them in the COVID crisis. They very much they almost coordinated their statements to say, we are not going to go down the route of downgrading Italy, downgrading countries that are very hardly hit by a crisis, because we are going to be the rock in the storm. And so in that sense, the UK crisis fits into my framings because it shows how the immense tension that rating agencies are put under in those crises, and how they can push the situation in both ways. But of course, it's never safe for them to say everything is okay when a crisis like that starts to erupt. And so that's why they are also pushing governments to behave in a way that that the rating agencies could credibly say everything is all right, this government is going to fix this. And I was saying that this is also linked to what Gaston was asking, is because in this sense, rating agencies are moving the markets, and in that sense, they are very similar to index providers, because there is this very strong coordination element. Everybody looks to rating agencies, not necessarily because they believe in their authority, but because ratings themselves technically change, for example, margin calls and change repo transactions and collateral calls and things like that. And therefore, they have an independent effect on markets. And it's the same thing with index providers, right? So if indices change, then that kind of changes the whole market because of the way that the markets are supposed to follow certain indicators such as indices and ratings.
Okay, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I think it's now time to wrap up this really fascinating discussion. And thank you very much, Sophia and Benjamin, for a really great presentation and for really great input and for a nice way to start our seminar for the second year. I would just like to say that in about a month, on the 28th of October, we will continue this with a focus on who's governing finance, central banks, and shadow banking. So basically, we just pick up where we ended off today. And we'll have Lev Menand and Stefano Ugolini with us. And we're looking very much forward to have all of you again, because it's amazing to have a crowd that you can discuss these kind of things just fluently. Katharina,
just again, thank you. We have to close, but thanks for coming. And also, if you have ideas for sessions and you may even want to present yourself, we are an open house. So just let us know. Some of the ideas already came in the chat, but just want to make a general announcement. Would love to have you. And see you